the consolidation of land allowed Singapore to essentially build up a very successful public housing program that many countries with more capital and more land couldn't do. I know there are some contradictions that come with the housing program, but I would like to first, ask, from your perspective, what has been the remarkable thing that has emerged out of this public housing policy experiment?
So land is one of the absolutely essential element for the housing program, right? But once the land is owned, then the government could use it in the way that it plans to do. So housing takes up that. The other important component in housing ownership, so to speak, is actually the availability of loans, mortgage. In a normal functioning capitalist economy, not everyone is able to borrow money from the bank. Not everyone has the credit reliability, right? Which is why home ownership is stratified. So what we have in Singapore is through the CPF system, right? Actually develop a mortgage system that is available to every working Singaporean, regardless of your level of income. And that is really important because it makes so-called home ownership possible across the board and not just for those who are able. I mean, in most countries, public housing system is only for those who are unable to pay their own way in the market. And so they need a subsidy, or they need subsidy in rental. You might also sometimes get assistance in mortgage interest rates. But public housing tend to be only it's a kind of residual welfare category. Whereas in Singapore, public housing is actually technically speaking for the entire nation, right? And it's largely because everyone is able to actually pay for their housing monthly, as long as they buy a flat within their income bracket, right, through the CPF system. So, which is why the home ownership rate is so high, or 99-year lease rate is so high, because both the government has the land to build and the citizen have a means to own or to buy the 99-year lease, as long as they have continuous employment. If they have disrupted employment, then there will be some gaps in which the monthly payment might be disrupted until re-employed or something. So that I think the availability of loans to every citizen is a very important component that does not exist in a normal capitalist society. On the supply side, right, is the land. On the demand side is the availability of mortgage system. And the dovetailing of that creates this sort of high 99-year leasehold ownership system.
It seems to me that when I was reading through the history of HDB and maybe the governance, Singapore's political history, public housing was really high on the agenda also because there was a bundle of incentives the government wanted to put together. So an example is, when Lee Kuan Yew and Goh Keng Swee were conceptualizing national service, they knew that, if I could guarantee people public housing or ensure that they have an asset to defend, they'll probably buy into the conscription system, right? Because now you have something to fight for, as opposed to maybe migrating to Australia or going to somewhere else, because you have to go and serve NS.
Well, actually, if you think about it, right, housing needn't be the top priority policy for the PAP government in 1959 or in early 1960. So, I mean, the PAP government got elected into power in 1959. In 1960, they already enacted the Housing Act, right? So it's 1 year, basically, of the new government, which means that it really did put a lot of priority on housing. And it really needn't be, even though it's true that, there were most large population living in informal housing, or what we now call kampongs, or or pejoratively called slums, right, or squatter areas. Already, I mean, people were living under those conditions. They were not ideal, but they were sort of housed. I mean, they were not like homeless on the street, right? And also, given the economic conditions of that time, living in a kampong actually has a lot of flexibilities because the unemployments were irregular, income were irregular, largely informal sector, and rent, therefore, rent in a kampong is very low and very flexible. Landlords is willing to take arrears until there is money to pay and so on. And admittedly, the public hygiene condition wasn't great, but the colonial government had already identified housing, poor conditions, and the squatter areas in the kampongs, particularly urban fringe kampongs, as public health problem. And that's fairly common in most government thinking. Even now when you look at so-called developing countries where there's large squatter areas, there will always be this idea that public health condition is very poor. So there's that. But so in a way, the government picked up on one of the British colonial government's agenda, which is to improve housing quality, improve public hygiene conditions, in particularly in the congested urban shophouse area and in the urban fringe kampong, right? So there's a kind of path dependency there. But I think what is more important is that in the 1959 election, the PAP government the PAP party at the time made a very clear promise that it will improve the physical living conditions of the nation. And so housing was a way of carrying through that election campaign promise. In addition to the fact that improving physical housing condition, right, is visually one of the most concrete, so to speak, illustration of the efficiency of the government, right?
Yeah.
Because it shows that the government is doing something and is visibly there. And if it improves the conditions of living, it's also undeniably materialist, right? So I think at both the symbolic and the practical level, housing is an area in which the government, particularly a very new government, is able to generate legitimacy, political legitimacy for itself. I guess once it gets started, the rest is so-called history, so to speak.
Yeah.
That's why I always claim that public housing is one of the key constituents of political legitimacy for the PAP, symbolically and materially.